I know you're super busy, and you're very generous, and we all appreciate it very much, really. And maybe me especially.
Hold on a second, just plugging the wrong. Okay, that's better. Could you start again, Sid? I just missed you for a moment there.
Okay. No, what I said is that.
Sorry, yeah, if you could just start again, sorry.
Okay. So I'm wanted to thank you. I'll do it officially in a minute, but unofficially, really for taking time out. And I know how busy you are, and it's a sign of your generosity. And it's a sign of our friendship that you're willing to do this. I mean, it's going way beyond the usual.
Just to correct you, I'm not that busy. It's, this pandemic has meant that people are a lot more efficient in having meetings. So, and I'm not commuting between here and Cambridge. So I'm happy you've given me something else to do.
Okay. Okay, well then I won't thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, you know what, let me ask Kripa.
Yes.
I just don't know who, yeah. You think we should begin?
Sure. Yeah.
Oh,
I think
okay.
a few more people are going to join in, but they're all like auto muted, so they won't disturb us while we're talking. Yeah, we can start.
Okay. Okay, so for everybody who's out there, you know what? I'm going to ask you, just so that our guests can see who's there, if you can turn on your cameras, and at least he'll have a chance of seeing the people who are there.
Very good.
And so while all of you are turning on your cameras, let me say a few words about Professor Harris, Dr. Harris, or Paul. In India, people tend to call people Dr. Paul. Okay, so for Dr. Paul, he has, every time I come to Cambridge in the United States, I write to him and we fix a time to get together, and we already know what he's going to write to me, so he doesn't even have to write it. We'll meet at noon under the clock next to the coop, and then we'll go to a Thai restaurant, and if we're really risque, we'll go to a Korean restaurant. And then we have, for me, really interesting discussions, catching up on all sorts of things, but also catching up on the scientific work that Paul is doing. I apologize, I have the hiccups, so you'll see me jumping up and down, and my voice won't be very smooth. Actually, maybe you thought that there was a problem with the connection, but it was my hiccuping, maybe. Okay. So let me say a few words about Dr. Paul. One of the things that struck me, of the many things that struck me, I told him about something that he was doing, and I asked him, it might have been around trust, and I asked him how he thought about it, how he got there. His answer was a classic for me. What he said was, I don't like to go where there are a lot of people. I like to be where there are a few people, and it's not very crowded. And I would say that that is characteristic of much of what Paul does. He has forged new areas or given interesting reads on areas that have been discussed in the past. And among the areas that he's worked in it's mostly around child development, but not only. And unlike his predecessors, major figures like Piaget and Vygotsky, who spoke about spontaneous concepts in their development. Spontaneous concepts that do not require people to tell you things, to intervene. It's enough that you're born with the brain that we have, and there's a world that is orderly and systematic, and our brain makes sense out of the systematic world. The social world for Piaget was mostly within the framework that he had of development, equilibrium, people contradicting each other, things of that nature. Vygotsky had one side that was more about the social side. And then in comes Paul, and he tells us, yes, of course, there are spontaneous concepts, and some of them are fundamental, the way that Piaget and Vygotsky spoke about things. But much of what we learn is what we've been told. So let's look at what this telling is. Let's look at who is telling and what they're telling, how they're telling, and the trust that children have in people who are passing on information, who are telling them things. In addition, Paul's worked on how children understand the unseen, the unobservable. There could be religious ideas like God or miracles. And there can even be concepts about science in the sense that there are scientific theories that nobody has seen. We see the effects of the theories, we see how they get expressed, but the theories themselves are also unobservable. Well, I can go on, and I won't, because we want to have the conversation with Paul. The bottom line is that Paul has been an innovator for a number of years, even though he's very young. And those innovations have really given direction to the field of child development, but around cognition, emotions, social interactions, and much more. So Paul, thank you for coming here. Thank you for being part of what's going to be a conversation. And it's around imagination. And we read your article. Maybe some have seen the clip that you sent around imagination. And around that, we'll now have our discussion. So thank you again. And so everybody, the floor is open, and whatever questions you have or comments that you want to make, here's your opportunity.
Would it be helpful, Sid, if I said a little bit about the situation of this paper in relation to my previous work?
Sure.
So very briefly, I don't want to give you a lecture, but let me just spend a couple of minutes trying to set the scene. So in the year 2000, I published a book called The Work of the Imagination. And the book attempted to show that although people traditionally, including Piaget and including Freud, were inclined to think of the imagination as a somewhat escapist mode, as a child sets the real world aside and starts thinking about fantasies and alternatives, wish fulfillment and so forth. I try to argue that that's an underestimate of the role that the imagination plays, that children often think about alternatives to what has really happened, but in doing so, they're inclined to go backwards and forwards between what has actually happened and what could have happened instead. So, in particular, in making moral judgments, they, for example, might condemn somebody for doing something when they could have behaved in a better fashion. In making causal judgments, they are inclined to say that something that has happened, perhaps a negative outcome, might not have happened had some precaution been in place or alternative procedure. So in other words, I gave a slightly more, not exactly rationalistic, but at least pragmatic account of the imagination as feeding into the way that children conceive of the way things really are. And then at the end of that book, I talked about the extent to which, and this is a theme that Sid has already touched on, the way that children could, first of all, imagine something that they have not seen, but guided by what other people tell them. So a child growing up in India might not have visited America or the UK, but can clearly learn a lot about those countries simply by being told about them. Similarly, a child may never have seen a germ, but they will learn from their parents that germs are things to be wary of, that certain things are contaminated by germs. And if you talk to 5 and 6-year-olds about whether there really are germs, they will be very content to tell you, yes, I'm very sure there are germs. And if you ask them what they look like, they confess to having no idea. So here's a nice example of where a child is dependent on other people's testimony. But my assumption was that they use that testimony to create a kind of mental representation, which they embroider with various properties, in the case of germs, of course, causal properties. And then, just to give you one other example, children, depending upon the culture in which they're being raised, will be told about various religious phenomena. They may hear about God or the afterlife. But again, these are phenomena which they can observe for themselves. And yet, I think most of us would acknowledge that those beliefs, true or false, play a big role in people's everyday life. So what I'm trying to say is that following the work on the book about the imagination, I then became interested in how children could use their imagination to build up a picture of the world, guided by what other people told them about things that they had not seen. And that resulted in another book called Trusting What You're Told, which was published in 2012. And I must admit, I've been sort of preoccupied by that theme, together with various doctoral students and postdocs for the last few years. But I was tempted to go back and think a bit more about children's imagination because of various newer publications which had been appeared on the scene since my own book, and which picked up on a theme which I did mention in the book, but didn't really elaborate on very extensively. And let me just underline that theme, because I think it's critical for getting a sense of what the chapter, the article that I asked you to read is all about. So if we take a 2-year-old who's playing a game of make-believe, perhaps with their older sibling or with their mother, it might be a game involving a tea party. Well, the child could easily watch their older sibling or their mother pick up a teapot and lift the teapot above a cup and then tip it. But the teapot is empty because this is just a pretend tea party. But you won't be surprised if you're watching a 2-year-old that they readily understand what's going on. In other words, they pick up that teacup and they start sipping tea from it. Now, how or why do they do that? Well, one of the things they must be doing is applying to that simple action of tipping the teapot some of their real world knowledge about what happens when you tip containers with liquid in them. When you do that, some of the liquid will come out of the container. Okay, but what happens, or what precisely will the liquid do? Will it go sideways? Will it go upwards? Well, clearly not. The force of gravity means that it will descend and it will enter the nearest container, or it will wet the nearest surface directly below, as it were, the line of pouring. Now, I'm belaboring this, but I think it's important to belabor it because I think it underlines the almost automaticity with which you and I understand a piece of make-believe, but also the automaticity with which a 2-year-old understands a piece of make-believe. And the more general point is that here's the child incorporating, transposing what they understand about reality into the world of make-believe, the world of pretend. Well, if you look, on the other hand, at a lot of writing about children's imagination, I tend to think of it as overly romantic. Romantic in the sense that it portrays the child as this terribly creative, fantastical creature who sets the world to one side and goes off on a spaceship or on a fantasy to explore the unknown. It's, the child is a kind of Star Trek character who goes on voyages of exploration. As I say, I think this is just romantic nonsense. Most of the pretend that children engage in is fairly prosaic in the sense that it recreates episodes, scripts, practices that they have observed around them. But nevertheless, that's rather impressive that they can draw on their knowledge and interpolate that knowledge into the fiction that they create, typically with another person, not always, but quite often. And so I began to think more about other areas where children are inclined to do that, to draw on their everyday knowledge and to use it to think about things which don't exist. And as you'll have seen in the chapter, one other very natural and frequent context for doing precisely that is when you and I, or a child, starts to think about the future. The future doesn't exist yet. It's coming down upon us, but we can, of course, anticipate what might happen in the future. And how do we do that? Well, for better or for worse, we often draw on what we know about the past, and we extrapolate from our knowledge of the regularities in the past to anticipate what might happen in the future. And indeed, it turns out, as I mentioned in the chapter, the article, that adults whose memory for the past has been disrupted, typically, for example, in the case of brain damage, work in the last couple of decades has shown that not only do those adult patients suffer from memory problems, but in line with what I've just claimed, they also suffer from projection or future planning problems. So if you invite them to think about the future, their problems are not just to do with remembering the past, they're also to do with drawing on the past in order to anticipate and imagine the future. And we see that same connection with young children. Children who are a bit better at remembering the past are somewhat more competent at envisioning the future with some detail. And then toward the end of the article, I talk about a couple of more obvious areas of where we might expect the child to be creative. One is creating a tool, and the other was drawing something that doesn't exist. And to cut a long story short, the evidence shows that young children are pretty bad at this, far from what you might think if you were wedded to the idea of the young child as a romantic voyager with a rich imagination. Children are not very good at inventing tools to solve practical problems, and nor when you give them an open-ended invitation to draw something that doesn't exist, they're often a little bit lost. Whereas on the other hand, if you give them a suggestion, they're rather good at following up on your suggestion. So I think children are receptive to input from other people, whether it's drawings or ideas about the invisible. But when they generate ideas, especially for pretend worlds or stories or drawings, they typically draw on their own past experience of reality. Okay, so there's a very synoptic version, and I'm happy, as soon as emphasized, to listen to your comments and try to answer questions. I see that Debasish has her hand up. Would you like to ask or comment, Debasish? Hi.
Hi, Dr. Paul. Thank you so much for the introduction. There are a few other hand raises. Apologies, I'm going ahead. Dr. Paul, there's a strange thing that I want to share with you. While I completely agree with you on the conclusion or the observations that you have put in the article, and also I saw the video, I have one what you call possibly a point of disagreement regarding the methodology you have used to arrive at the conclusion. My problem is, Dr. Paul, that does the analysis also cover multiple societies? Because, for example, the entire technology coming of the technology age in India started somewhat probably during 2000 or a little later than that, especially for children, because I remember growing up till I was in my 10th grade, I didn't have quite a good access to computing facilities, like, latest technological tools and other things. But when I see my, later ones that grow up, people who had the advantage of having access to these tools at a young age, way faster and, way quicker than a lot of other adults, they seem to know a lot more about, technological imagination, if I can put the term like that. So would it be wise to say that, societies which are in a certain state of transition, especially transition in terms of generations, probably, I don't know if generation gap would be a right word to use, but I just want to convey that where the world is changing fast and new tools and techniques are being accessible to a generation, succeeding generation, far faster than its preceding generation. Will such a generation show higher imaginative skills? And also, because the 5 parameters you have used for judging imagination, what would you call certain cases of imagination where people have been able to recall things way deeper into their past? For example, I was seeing a video of a 4-year-old boy who knew the entire dimensions of aeroplane cockpit. Now, these are things which are not scientifically proven, but there is evidence that such things exist, because even between siblings who grow up in the same environment, there are some who are more receptive to tools and techniques, memorizing and taking things up faster than others who are not. Now, there is something which is different, which cannot be completely justified by the existential mindset and things that just age or certain experience, probably what we have this concept of multiple lives and reincarnations in Indian society strongly fixed, which I don't want to bring it because I don't have science to back it up. But hopefully I'm able to convey my point here, that A is that do societal transitions have a big impact, and second is the differences that we have between two people growing in the same society, same environment, but having same age, but difference in imaginative power. What can show that, prove that, or explain that? Thank you, Dr. Paul. Thank you very much.
Okay, so 2 broad questions. One about historical changes partly due to technology, and the other about individual differences. Let me begin by saying I think psychology has not been very good at thinking deeply about the impact of technological innovation. So I give you a brief example. In the 1950s, when television was being introduced, people began to worry about the pros and cons of allowing children to watch television. And I remember a famous study done in the United Kingdom, because at that particular early time, and I think it was the late 50s or mid 50s, some parts of the UK had television available and other parts didn't. And so you had a very nice natural experiment where you could study children's development in these 2 settings. But as time went on, what actually happened was that the agenda of research on the impact of television became almost hijacked by anxieties about the extent to which children were being exposed to aggressive cartoons and the extent to which their social and emotional development would be distorted as a result. So despite a great deal of expenditure, I feel as if we never really arrived at any terribly interesting conclusions about the impact of television. And I regret to say that I think the same is happening a little bit these days with respect to children's access to screens, to the internet. There's a good deal of anxiety about what the effects will be, but not very theoretically motivated research. What you tend to end up getting are recommendations from pediatricians about the number of hours a child should or should not be allowed to watch a screen during the day, which is, the evidence, the advice is not really grounded in scientific investigation, I don't think. And alongside that, you have people who worry that, exposure to computers is going to rewire our brains. But we know that, all sorts of exposure, whether it's if you're a London taxi driver, your brain gets rewired because you learn the map of London. If you spend a great deal of time reading, your brain gets rewired because reading changes the organization of the brain. So the same is going to be true for young children. So I must admit that I'm not giving a good answer to your question. I'm just telling you why I don't think there is a good answer at the moment. But let me at the very least speculate as to what the answer might turn out to be in the light of the article that you've read. So I think I would be sympathetic to the idea that when children, even 4 and 5-year-olds, are technologically competent, it does mean that their access to a lot of information about the world is probably enlarged. So they can learn about airplanes if that's their preoccupation, or they can learn about dinosaurs if that's their preoccupation. And if anything, they can, in some sense, explore this not by virtue of print, but by virtue of some kind of visual representation, possibly a guided tour, so to speak, of the land of the dinosaurs, or a guided tour of the interior of an airplane, including the cockpit. So that would imply that what children have as the stock of knowledge about reality is going to be amplified by their access to times and places that they wouldn't otherwise be able to visit. And so I'm assuming then that to the extent that the imagination is guided by this stock of knowledge, broadly speaking, children's stock of knowledge is going to be expanded by access to the internet. And so we may well see some changes in the kinds of things that children think about in their pretend play, and of course in the kind of scenarios that they entertain in terms of what the future might be like. They can envisage a future which perhaps for you and certainly for me is slightly alien to some extent. So broadly speaking, I would say that technology is going to feed children's knowledge of reality, and in turn, that will feed children's imagination. There is a sidebar or side note, though, to this, I think, which is that, of course, these days, children also have access to a lot of fictional material, cartoons, and so forth. And I'm less clear about what the impact of that is likely to be. A lot of these fictional materials are coming out of movie making empires, including Disney, and you have the equivalent, if not more so, in India. And to some extent, I worry then that children's imagination is going to be infused by the particular tropes, the superheroes, the princesses that often feature in these fictional entertainments for children. On the other hand, what research there is suggests that, and this is an intriguing finding, that when you study children's spontaneous pretend play, especially the younger children, you don't see them incorporating very much of a fantastical nature. So in other words, you don't necessarily see them pretending to be superheroes or imagining special powers. Again, reality pervades their imaginative world. On the other hand, maybe it's too early to be confident that situation will continue, because the quantity of input that the children are getting from these media is, of course, dramatically different from what it was even 10 years ago or 20 years ago, when some of the studies that I was reviewing were being conducted. So I guess, there's an opportunity here for interesting research, but again, it's tricky to do because you want, ideally, to have a group of children you want two groups of children who are otherwise comparable, but differ in their access or exposure to this kind of material so that you can look for differences. Whereas what often is the case is that the child who has, access to certain kinds of internet opportunities differs in all sorts of ways from the child who lacks such opportunities. So drawing inferences about the differences between the children is tricky. So let me now come to your second question about individual differences. I must admit, I don't have a great deal to say about individual differences, and you'll have seen that in the paper. And the part of the reason for that was that I think a lot of work on the development of the imagination has been somewhat hung up on the idea that some children are more creative than others. And if you look at some of the interesting and influential work, especially done in the United States, that's a major theme. So, for example, Marjorie Taylor has studied children who have imaginary companions, invent an imaginary companion and play with that imaginary companion for several months, occasionally for years, and compared those children to children who don't invent such an imaginary companion. The idea being that the children who've invented an imaginary companion are somehow qualitatively different, more creative, perhaps more socially astute than those who don't. Actually, when you look at the data, these individual differences are not very solid. They do show up, of course, in the context of pretending. It's true that some children do and some children don't have an imaginary companion. But when you look for other correlates of those differences, they tend to be elusive and not very stable when you do longitudinal work. So, I mean, to put it bluntly, the child who invents an imaginary companion aged 4 is not necessarily going to look very different from the child who didn't when you revisit those two children some years later. Having said all that, I'm certainly open to the idea that children have their own particular interests that they like to pursue. And these days, of course, given access to the internet, they can indeed pursue their interests in a very intensive fashion. So a child who's interested in, I don't know, octopuses can spend hours exploring the internet for information about octopuses. Whereas when I was a child, you were lucky to find one book in the library about octopuses, and that was the extent of it, so to speak. Not that I did. I was not an octopus fan, but just to take that as an example. So it's possible that the differences that you mentioned are going to be amplified just because children can pick their own niche, so to speak. They can choose their own particular topic of interest and pursue it in ways that were much less feasible, much less practical for children growing up 50 years ago or even further back. So we'll see. We're going to see, I think, a kind of diversification and intensification among children of their interests. Let me see who's next. Yamuna, I see your hand is up.
Good morning, Dr. Harris. Also, our director of the lab, Dr. Bhavani Rao, is having her hand raised. So I will let her ask her question first, and I'll get to my question after that.
Okay, Bhavani.
That's okay, Yamuna. You can go ahead. I think there were a couple of hand raises that came.
Yeah, there was a couple.
I think Gayatri,
Yeah.
Abhijit, all of them raised their hands earlier, but I can go last. No worries.
Okay. So thank you for this wonderful discussion. It's really amazing to have the chance to speak with you. And my comment was a bit on the line of what Debashish was mentioning regarding, but it's not so much about the interest of the children in terms of topics, but it will be more in terms of actually of values. Meaning that like if I take my own experience as a field of investigation, because I didn't do research on children, and also about the discussion we had in the place where we live. It's like for children, actually, it's like for them to understand reality, they're going to check that with their parents or with their peers or with whoever is around. And definitely, like because of the law that exists related to the material world, like I understand the example that children will understand that they cannot go through a wall. But when we speak in terms of values and the kind of skills that are more interpersonal skills or intrapersonal skills that children are growing, are developing in them, and not the kind of apprehension of the material environment that is there, I wonder how it works. Like, let me give you an example to be very precise. Like, let's say children see a lion eating a deer, and the children is shocked because it might say, oh, what's happening? Why is killing the deer? It's not nice to do something like that. And one parent who is believing in science may say, this is a rule of nature, and the stronger, this is a rule of the fittest. So then the child gets the sense that in the world, this is the strongest that survive, and this is actually a world of competition. And this can be a culture in some families, in some places. But in some other places, the child will get an explanation that in the animal world, animals are killing for eating. And that killing is acceptable because it's a survival and this is how they eat. But that for humans, it is different because and then the moral is coming in. So I was wondering regarding this imagination, how it is actually related to moral and also relating it also to the constructionism of paper. Like we have Piaget who is speaking about constructivism. So the child is learning from the conditioning, from whatever is taught around him. But when we speak about values, a child may have a feeling that what is taught to him is not right. Like we may say that a child who feels that it's not always about the competition in the world and there's something beyond that, there's some righteousness in what's happening, or like they have a different feelings, they might not be able to express it, but they might not take it. And then they try to build a different perception of it and get maybe like through different experience and get a different like understanding of what's happening. And they will not take what has been given to them as an explanation. I hope my question is clear, but yeah, it's more on the side of the value-based education and moral education that I'm speaking, and not so much about the material world and how the imagination and the understanding of the children of value is built, knowing that there is also always this part of like what Debashish also was mentioning of the own feeling of the child regarding his own apprehension of the world, that he might not accept what is taught to him, but he has his own feeling about the world. So thank you for listening to my question. Yeah. I hope it's clear.
Yes. Yamuna, before I answer, I have to ask you, did you spend time in France?
I'm French.
Voilà, c'est ça. Okay. Okay, so to answer your question, the work that I have done, and you put your finger on, to some extent, a limitation of the work, has mostly focused on children's apprehension of, as you say, of the material world, of the factual world, rather than of the world of values. However, that is slowly changing, and I'll mention a couple of examples. So if we look back at the research that's been done on children's moral development, I think the conception of the child as a rather autonomous thinker has been very dominant. So, for example, if we go back to Piaget, the story that Piaget tells about the child's moral development is that at first the child listens to authority, but gradually works out their own moral principles in an autonomous fashion. It's a kind of transition from a sort of Durkheimian morality to a more Kantian stance with respect to moral principles. And even if you look at more recent research on children's moral development, the idea of the child as exercising autonomy is very influential. So there's a lot of fascinating work which is grouped together under the title of social domain theory. You may know of this. At any rate, the idea is that children, even at a young age, work out that there are some prescriptions that we encounter which have a genuine moral basis, and there are other prescriptions which we encounter which have a more conventional basis. So not hitting other people is morally grounded. The fact that boys wear trousers and girls or boys don't wear dresses, let me put it like that, is a convention. And if you ask young children about violations of a moral rule versus a conventional rule, they're inclined to judge the violation of a moral rule as more serious than the violation of a conventional rule. And even if you ask them to speculate about a country or a school where adults don't punish you for anything that you do or don't reprimand you, they still insist that to be aggressive or to take things from other people is wrong in the absence of any kind of apparent adult sanction. So the theme has been young children develop their own morality, essentially. And if anything, the implication has been that at this foundational level, the morality that children develop is going to be pretty stable from one culture to another. I've always had my doubts about this claim. It seems to me we know enough about adult judgments to know that there's a lot of disagreement about what the moral thing to do is, and particularly at the more political and legal level, there are dramatic historical shifts in what we think of as morally acceptable, whether we're talking about slavery or the women's rights to vote, or to take a more contemporary case, whether two men or two women can get married to each other. So it's pretty evident that our value system, far from being stable and autonomous and fixed, is something that changes. So, sorry, this is a rather long-winded reply, but I'll get there, I promise you, in the end. So I began then to think about, in small ways, not in a very programmatic way, but in small ways, about domains in which the child might indeed be influenced in their moral thinking by other people, or to some extent realize that perhaps that what other people were saying was not completely coherent. And you gave some interesting examples in discussing the lion killing the deer. So anyway, to together with a doctoral student called Karen Hazar, we did an interesting study of children who this was done in the United States. The situation might be very different in India, particularly in Kerala. We did a study of children who were growing up in non-vegetarian traditional American homes where a lot of meat was eaten, but these children had decided to become vegetarian. We refer to them as independent vegetarians. And we talked to them about their reasons for not eating meat. And what was fascinating was that they typically gave what you would think of as pretty good moral reasons. They talked a lot about the suffering and death that eating meat presupposes. We also talked to regular children, meat-eating children, again, growing up in meat-eating homes, about not eating meat. And we asked them to think of a type of meat that they never ate. Most children, there's some particular kind of meat, whether it's liver or whatever, that they don't like to eat. And we say, we ask them, okay, so you don't eat that, why don't you eat it? And in their case, animal welfare was never mentioned. It was always a question of taste and occasionally a question of health. So we got these dramatic differences between the two groups of children. But that raised all sorts of questions, really, particularly about the independent vegetarian children. How come they had reached this somewhat autonomous stance, which I think was something that you yourself had in mind, that the child might reflect on what they're told and come up with hesitations and doubts about its acceptability. We were not able to get good, excuse me, to get detailed information about this. But our impression was that often these vegetarian children had friends who were vegetarian children. And from these friends, they had gathered information about the conditions under which animals are raised, especially in more industrialized farming settings in the United States. And they had come to the conclusion on the basis of this information that they wanted to become independent vegetarians. So the conclusion that we arrived at was that what we are seeing among these children was a very fascinating combination of, on the one hand, independent mindedness, because after all, they had to persuade their mother to cook them a vegetarian meal every day, even though the mother was a meat eater herself. So there was the independent mindedness, but at the same time, our impression was that these independent thoughts were triggered by testimonial information provided by other children, which was, of course, overlooked or ignored by the vast majority of children. I mean, we're talking in the United States about a tiny minority of children. The vast majority are carnivorous. But I think that particular mini case study is perhaps illustrative of other areas where children may have some underlying moral principles, such as not causing suffering or not causing harm, and then on the basis of information that they gather, not necessarily from their parents, but from the larger world, come to see that the adult world is inconsistent, that these principles are not fully applied in the way that they should be. And so perhaps with respect, for example, I guess children's anxieties and moral stance with respect to climate change strikes me as another fascinating example, where to some extent young people are more principled and more coherent than the adult world. I'm happy to say that only, but in part because of this earlier work that we did on independent vegetarians, other researchers in the United States are beginning to think about the extent to which children's moral development is not just this linear autonomous progression, but to some extent will be guided and redirected by the kind of information that children can gather, which will, for example, show them, as in the case of the vegetarian children, that a rule which they already subscribe to also applies to this situation where they didn't think it applied. So don't cause harm and distress applies to the food on your plate, so to speak, if you think it through. So all that to say, I think there's plenty of room for more research on the extent to which testimonial input can shift children's moral thinking.
Thank you for this beautiful answer. It's
Okay.
very, yeah. Thank you so much.
Good.
I see in the chat that people have been posting questions. Maybe Nandita or Bhavani, you want to, shall we read them out, or you want to read them to see which one you would like to answer?
I'm hopeless at the chat, so why doesn't whoever would like to go first tell me their question?
Sid is moderating, so maybe Sid can actually, Sid, do you want to take this over?
Actually, Paul, people have asked questions. They've written them in chat.
Yeah.
So if you want, you can take a look at what's there and then decide which ones you want to answer. But if not, then the Master of Ceremonies will be Nandita. So would you rather just choose?
I think I'm happy to depend on Nandita, because if I start looking at the chat, it's going to take a while. So okay. Why doesn't Nandita suggest somebody who can summarize their question?
Hello, Dr. Harris. Yeah, my name is Nandita. We are really very honored to have you. Unfortunately, I cannot turn on my video for some reason, so my apologies for that.
No problem.
Indeed, we have a full chat, and it's a really proper reflection of the interest of our audience also. I just go, and dear colleagues, please forgive me if I cannot keep the order of the raised hands, but I just go through the list of the chat. So Abhijit, a PhD student, she's very interested in, there are two parts to one question that I have. Number one, the first part boils down to the whether the understanding drawn from your paper is same for the curiosity. And number two, since we know imagination is embedded in curiosity, and in similar studies, they have shown a difference between weird, Western, as an acronym, stands for Westernized, educated, industrialized, rich and democratic countries, and non-weird countries, children having varied degrees of curiosity. So that is the question in a nutshell, and then she asks, how do we explain imagination there?
Okay, so
Anita, why don't you read out the other questions too, so that Dr. Harris can pick what he wants to answer.
All right, then another question, Dr. Harris.
Well, actually, I think it's going to be, I think I'll get into a muddle if you if you present me with a lot of questions. So why don't I just give an answer to this one, and then we can just move on, okay?
Of course. What fits best to you? Yeah.
Sure.
Thank you.
So let me just say some brief words then about curiosity and the extent to which curiosity varies in different cultures. So one of the most interesting pieces of research, to my mind, that's come out in the last few years was a fascinating study of children's questions. So the investigator took advantage of the fact that in the 1970s, so quite a long time ago, Roger Brown, a developmental psychologist and psycholinguist, and his doctoral students who were interested in the acquisition of language visited a small number of children every couple of weeks in Cambridge, here close to where I am. And they tape recorded the children talking to their parents and siblings. And then these conversations were transcribed. And Roger Brown and his colleagues, this was in the era when Chomsky was a very influential figure. Brown and his colleagues looked at the extent to which the child's utterances became more grammatically, syntactically sophisticated. But the content of the children's utterances was not really investigated very much. However, latterly, all of these data files are transcribed, and there are computer programs for searching through thousands and thousands of childhood utterances. And you can search for particular kinds of utterances. And so what an investigator called Michel Chouinard did was to search through children's utterances for all the questions that children asked. And to summarize, she found that questions start very early at around 2 years of age, if not earlier. Secondly, that the majority of children's questions are not attention seeking, but information seeking. They're also not just a question of trying to get permission for something, but children are generally asking for more information. And by about 2.5, we see that children go beyond questions about what something is called or what something is for, and they start asking explanation-seeking questions. I was fascinated by these findings, partly because it was a support to my idea that children faced with uncertainty will turn to other people for guidance, will listen to what other people tell them. And children's questions are an index of the extent to which they, in some sense, acknowledge their own ignorance and defer to other people, and indeed, in certain circumstances, have a fairly lengthy conversation about some topic that preoccupies them. So it's interesting, actually, to compare what children are like at home with what they're like when they're in preschool. And some children have been studied in both of those contexts. What you find, sadly, is that the number of questions that children ask when they're in school is much less. And in particular, the extent to which they have this extended dialogue back and forth with an adult is rather infrequent in school as compared to what happens at home. So the same child looks very different depending on whether you watch or listen to that child at home versus in school. So I would argue that one great way to study children's curiosity is by looking at their spontaneous questions. It's a natural index of the kind of thing that is on their mind. And I'm happy to say that a former doctoral student of mine, Samuel Ronfar, together with some colleagues, recently published with Cambridge University Press a book, an edited book, exploring lots of research on children's questions. Now, let me come to the weird aspect of the issue. So this acronym was proposed by Joseph Henrich here at Harvard and his colleagues, arguing that maybe there's something distinctive about Western educated industrialized communities, distinctive in their ways of thinking, and to the extent that psychologists recruit their subjects mostly from those communities, maybe psychologists are deceiving themselves in thinking that what they discover has some kind of universal application. The worry is that it doesn't, and that when we move to other contexts, other cultural contexts, we'll discover that what has been taken for granted as the truth about human psychology is actually qualified in these other contexts. And I think it's worth emphasizing the possibility that everything I've just said about children's questions is subject to that criticism. In other words, we know very little about the extent to which young children, aged 2, 3, 4, and 5, ask questions in a systematic and sometimes tenacious fashion of adults in communities outside of North America and Western Europe. There are 1 or 2 studies out there, but they were opportunistic and they were not really targeting that particular issue. It was reanalyses of studies of naturalistic observation done many years ago in certain traditional communities. So actually there's a fascinating and important research question out there. What is early childhood like for a child growing up in India, for a child growing up in China? Do we see the same kind of tenacious, frequent questioning on the part of the child? Or alternatively, and this is what some of my overseas students here at Harvard have implied, is it the case that young children are sometimes regarded as disrespectful to their adults, to the adults looking after them, if they persistently ask questions, so that, if anything, this tenacious questioning might be a distinctive feature of, so to speak, Anglo-Saxon and Western European culture, but not something that's universal. I think it's an open question, but definitely one that's worth pursuing. Okay,
Wonderful.
yeah.
Thank you,
Thank you,
Dr.
sir. Thank
Harris,
you.
for this insightful answer. Thank you also, Abhijit. So I would like to go to the next question, and just to give an overview, together with Dr. Bhavani, we have 5 questions, and just to prepare you what is there. So
Okay.
Dr. Bhavani is asking 2 questions. What about children who have trauma and choose to forget the past, so that their recall of their past is impacted? Some children impacted by trauma also create worlds that are not associated with reality. So do people with schizophrenia. How does your work explain that? The second comment is on imagination therapy and imagination-based meditation. So she says, Dr. Wani says, I was wondering if we can be trained to imagine a positive and a better world. Can that impact their capacity to actually create that better world? Thank you.
Okay. So picking up the first question then about children who were exposed to trauma, I must admit that's a question I hesitate to speculate on. It's not an issue that I've done any research on, in the sense that, to the best of my knowledge, the majority of the children that have been included in the studies that I've done or my students have done have not been, so to speak, traumatized. The closest that I can get is that I have been very interested in children's the accuracy of children's recall. There's been a fascinating debate over the last 20 years about the extent to which children, especially if they're repeatedly questioned, are prone to invent a memory which didn't actually take place. So just to concretize this a little bit, there's a famous report by Piaget of his own childhood, when apparently his nurse took him for a walk in the park, and they were approached by somebody who was threatening to kidnap Piaget, the little boy, and the nurse fended off this threat, and Piaget's family gave the nurse a Swiss watch as a reward. Well, many years later, this nurse became more religiously devout and felt guilty because she had in fact fabricated this whole story about the kidnapper. And she went back to Piaget's family and explained that she had misled them. I presume she returned the watch as a form of apology. But Piaget's point was that for many years, he was quite convinced that this incident had actually taken place. And he explains the possibility then that because he was overhearing these conversations between his nurse and his parents, that alone was sufficient to lead him to think that the event had actually taken place. I think I draw a couple of lessons from this, but I hesitate to go any further. So in the wake of Piaget's anecdote and a lot of other research, there is indeed plenty of evidence that children, when they discuss things, and in some sense I've already said this, will, as it were, use their imagination to construct in their mind's eye a representation of the events and episodes that are being described. It looks as if what happens is that as time goes on, to the extent that this representation and this imaginative representation of the event seems increasingly familiar, for example, the episode might be repeatedly discussed, the child retrieves the same representation, but now it becomes to seem all too familiar, and the child is thereby persuaded that because it's familiar, it's something that actually happened rather than something that they only learned about by people talking about it. Now, children are not alone in this. There's all sorts of evidence from adults that they too, both as adults and with respect to their own childhood, are prone to misremember what actually happened. So the moral that I draw from this is that the child's construction of what they think is actually the case is readily guided by testimonial input from other people, because that testimonial input is rapidly converted into, in their mind, something that's quasi-real. And of course, in the cases that I've just described, that can be problematic, particularly if one's depending upon the child to be a witness, for example, in a legal case, accusations of child abuse or whatever. But from a less legalistic, less forensic point of view, this capacity for the child to construct in their imagination a representation that's quasi-real is very beneficial, because it allows them to enlarge their conception of reality on the basis of what they're told. So that's a rather indirect answer, I'm afraid, but it's as it were, a capsule account of my thinking about the relationship between imagination and reality. As for schizophrenia, I will say nothing. I am absolutely uninformed about the latest research on schizophrenia, so I can't help there. So let's move on to the question about imagining a better world. Could you just restate that question?
Maybe
Yes, I can.
go
Yeah,
ahead.
yeah. Yeah.
There are therapies that allow you to visualize a better world, and like you have a very strong imagination. They ask you to imagine. They take you through imaginative therapies where you imagine a better situation. So my question was, I mean that those are not necessarily informed by science, but there's some part of your paper that says that when you actually imagine it, you get better answers. So I was just wondering, if you actually imagine a better situation, does that improve your capacity to actually make that happen? I mean, even if it is building your own capacities to make it happen. I was just extrapolating on what you had said in your paper.
Yes. I believe there is pretty good evidence of this, these effects of the imagination, at least in more circumscribed domains. So as far as I know, in the field of athletics, let's say tennis players, repeated imagining of making a particular tennis stroke in some sense can facilitate the smooth execution of that tennis stroke. So to that extent, the imagined activity transposes itself into something, semi-actual. So I suppose one could extrapolate from that and argue that if it applies to tennis strokes, it could apply in a broader way to the way that one envisages responding. I don't know, let's imagine one has a tempestuous relationship with a particular colleague. One could imagine pre-rehearsing more charitable or, peaceable rejoinders to this exasperating colleague. And so when the occasion arises, one actually enacts those more constructive responses. So I think I'm open to the idea, but I must admit, this is not an area where I have done any research. So what I'm doing is freewheeling a little bit from what little research I know that speaks to that.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Yes. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So the next question would be from
Sorry.
Gayatri.
Sorry, can I just add one other thing which comes to my mind on the imagination topic? There is a pretty well-established body of work in behavior therapy which speaks to this. Now I think about it. So one of the therapies which seems, let's take the case of a person who's very afraid of snakes. One of the strategies that's used is so-called, I think it's called habituation therapy. So the snake is shown to the person in a box 20 feet away, and then a little bit later, it's a glass container so the snake can be seen. And then a little bit later, the person is moved to 10 feet away from this glass box. So bit by bit, the person is habituated to being close to a snake, and as time goes on, their anxiety wanes. To the best of my knowledge, these techniques can also work if the exposure, as it's called, the graded exposure therapy is conducted by the imagination. So at first, the person envisages being in the same room where there's a snake in a box. And then a bit later on, the person envisages or imagines being in the same room with a snake inside a glass container. and so forth. To the best of my knowledge, these imagination-based therapies can be almost as effective as reality-based therapies. And it's as if, so to speak, just as fear and anxiety can abate in reaction to the real stimulus, so fear and anxiety can abate in reaction to an imagined stimulus with the same longer-term positive effects. Okay, sorry, that just came to my mind after. Yeah.
Not at all, not at all. Thank you, Dr. Harris. Just to check on your time. So as far as my information, we would have 10 more minutes. Is that correct? Or can we extend the session? So I would like to hear your feedback regarding your time frame.
Yes, we can. I'm sure we can extend it. Why don't we aim to finish at least by, let's say, in another 35 minutes? So that may overextend it, but at any rate, let's not feel we need to shut immediately.
Okay, wonderful. So then I would like to continue with the next question. It's from Gayatri ma'am. She's one of our colleagues at AMMACHI Labs, and she posted, when we talk about training children to be innovative and creative, especially with technology tools, I have found with my work with children on storytelling that they go through stages, from copy exact to making small variations, to modifying parts, to creating something completely new. So I think it does take time to encourage creativity in children, especially around technology tools. What would be Dr. Paul's inputs on training children on creativity and innovation? Thank you, ma'am.
Yes, my input, I think, would be very much in line with what you're saying. So I think in all sorts of domains, children can be creative insofar as they gradually master, so to speak, the repertoire within that particular area. So bit by bit, they can move on from relatively faithful copying to modest variation to more adventurous variation. But I'm tempted to say what you're proposing is something that's more reality-based, so to speak, and somewhat more realistic about the child's imaginative capacities. I think in lots of early childhood education circles, the idea that the child should, so to speak, be put on a slower apprenticeship is not taken very seriously. It's as if the child is thought to be so imaginative as to be able to leap to the final stages rather than steadily progressing from faithful imitation to something more creative. But I think your point applies in all sorts of domains, not just on storytelling or perhaps coding if a young child is learning to code. But similarly, if the child is, learning to play the piano, and it applies to us as scientists. It's rare for anybody to make a creative contribution unless they've mastered the body of knowledge and literature that's already out there. So to that extent, I'm inclined to adopt a more plodding, if you like, notion of how children arrive at the end of the day at some level of creativity. I think, like us adults, they go through stages of apprenticeship and eventual freedom.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, Nandita.
Thank you. Thank you. So next question would be then from one of our PhD students, Nihal. And she posted, according to my unimpressive memory of digit, it takes about 10 to 13 years for as less as 50 to 20% of psychological scientific studies to be implemented as community practices where the findings can be of benefit. So she says creativity plus imagination plus ability to innovate. These are foundational 21st century skills. How can we use this valuable knowledge in brackets, which kind of contradicts what one would normally assume? Or perhaps in what ways has it been utilized in the direction of cultivation of creativity and curiosity in children across cultures? Many thanks.
Okay, so if I'm understanding the question, it's lamenting the fact that the flow of information from psychological research to community practices is pretty slow. And so what is the likely future with respect to the flow of information about children's creativity and imagination and ability? And to what extent is that going to be applied, or how should we apply it looking toward the future? I must admit, I have a slightly ambivalent reaction to this question, partly because I feel how to put this? Here in my department, the Graduate School of Education here at Harvard, I also hear people talking about 21st century skills. And I always feel this is a little bit over the top. It's as if we've somehow, as human beings, arrived at this new century where something dramatically different is required of us. Whereas I'm inclined to think that if you look back over the past 20 centuries, the vast majority of human beings lead their lives in the steps of their ancestors, so to speak. It's only in the 21st century, and perhaps especially on the west coast of the United States, that moving quickly and breaking things, as the phrase goes, has come to be seen as a value in itself. And I must admit, I'm fairly skeptical. So in other words, without wanting to dampen the freedom that young children are given in preschool and kindergarten to engage in play, I think the idea that we should be fretting about the extent to which they're going to contribute 15 years later to some sort of technical revolution is an unnecessary anxiety. Yeah, maybe I'm sticking my head in the sand, because certainly human beings, as we've seen in the last year, face some grave challenges, whether we're talking about pandemics or climate change or major political disturbance. On the other hand, it's also true that human beings have faced these kinds of dramatic changes in the past. So I guess I'm reluctant to answer the question. In other words, I'm reluctant to feed into the idea that one of our priorities should be in fretting about the alleged skills that are needed in the 21st century for a child who's going to grow up within that century. I think I'm sounding like an old fuddy-duddy, an old conservative who's sticking his head in the sand, but there we are.
Not at all. Thank you, Dr. Harris, and also thank you to Nihan for that question. So I would go to the next question. And then Dr. Sophia's question, then we would finish our session.
Okay.
So Tsur, one of our colleagues and also PhD student, is asking, my question is related to Debashish's question. So Debashish was the PhD scholar who asked the first question in that session, in this session. So I'm questioning about those special kids that were able to complete their creative tasks successfully under the assumption they have not had prior experience. In brackets, hard to know, I guess. But under that assumption, they seem to be the more interesting population to examine closely. That is because it may shed light on what the brain is capable of, rather than what the standard or average is, which is of course great descriptive data for understanding the current state of things. Closing the bracket again. So, but perhaps the average is not accepting the right education, and that can be mitigated in various ways if creativity is such an important trait. So he says, Bhavani, I take my hand down. Oh, okay, that don't belong to the question. So I hope that was clear, Dr. Harris. If not,
well, I'm not sure which particular studies we're focusing on here, but let me emphasize some of the studies I reviewed in the article. These were the studies on tool manufacture, tool innovation. And what is interesting is that, as one investigator, Sarah Beck, emphasized, when we're talking about children aged 6 or 7 or 8, there's a good deal of variation among the children. Some of them are pretty good at, say, bending the hook in order to retrieve the basket down inside the tube. But other children are not so good. And Sarah Beck and her colleagues tried to identify personality factors which correlated with good performance versus not such good performance. And to cut a long story short, the project was a failure. They couldn't find any stable personality differences which predicted who was going to be, quotes, creative and who was not. And if anything, the problem is even deeper than that failure implies, because in the paper, they don't demonstrate that the child who's good at, for example, making a hook is also good at thinking, oh, I ought to pour water into the tube because that will lift the peanut, which I'm trying to get a hold of. In other words, we don't even have evidence that a child who's good at solving creativity problem number 1 is also going to be good at solving creativity problem number 2. So developmental psychology, for better or for worse, couldn't really tell you who is a creative child. Now, I gave you some examples earlier on of efforts to do that. The work by Marjorie Taylor on children with imaginary companions. So what she did was not to say, let's give the child a problem, but let's look at the child's natural disposition to engage in acts of the imagination. But again, as I emphasized earlier, it's not as if those individual differences seem to be a stable diagnostic feature of how that child is going to turn out. So I would, to some extent, make a plea for not emphasizing individual differences. I think when we talk about the imagination, it's very tempting to think that, oh, some people are imaginative, others less so. If anything, I would try to convey to you the message that everybody, all of us, all human beings are deeply imaginative. We all deploy our imagination in countless ways in our everyday lives, whether it's in planning a bus route or envisaging what we'll say to our partner, or in taking in information from the news and imagining what it would be like to be living under the conditions that are portrayed in the news. That strikes me from a psychological point of view as a much richer and more humanistic enterprise than this endless search to identify those few people who are creative. So that's my sermon, so to speak. Pay attention to the creativity and imagination which we human beings are blessed with, rather than worrying too much about how to nurture the creativity of the happy few.
Thank you very much, Professor.
You're welcome.
Thank you, Dr. Harris and Sur. So our last question here in the chat would be from one of our colleagues, Sophia, Dr. Sophia. So she says, or said, when I went to school, I got the impression that the main goal of formal education is to eliminate the imagination of children. It was all about creating conformity, and all divergent thinking led to negative sanctions. And in brackets, I went to school in Germany in the 90s. However, older children do seem to learn much from using their imagination. In any case, I'm wondering how people's imaginative abilities survive schooling. Thank you.
Okay, so again, this is another theme which I, to some extent, dissent from. So let me lay out exactly why I disagree. So if you enjoy TED Talks, one of the most popular TED Talks in the history of TED Talks was created by the English educator Ken Robinson, Sir Ken Robinson. I think it's got 66 million viewers, so you might want to go online and become the 66 million and 1st viewer. I looked at it again recently, and he's enormously entertaining. He's very funny. He could almost have been a stand-up comedian. He's beautiful timing. However, if you listen to this talk, it's got two characteristics. One of the important characteristics is that he is complaining, along the lines that you just did, that many schools depress or dull or constrain children's imagination. But if you listen to the talk carefully, he presents no evidence that this is the case. What he does is, with some very captivating anecdotes, make you laugh and persuade you that something like that is true. Now, why do I say it's dubious, what he's claiming? Well, the evidence that I presented in the article suggests that actually it's not as if young children have a very adventurous imagination. So the idea that school comes along and somehow takes this adventurous and rich imagination starts off from the premise that young children already have a good imagination. And if school would leave them alone, it would become even more effective. But my story is completely different. It's that young children have an imagination. Absolutely, they have an imagination, but it's not one that's deeply creative in the sense of being very adventurous or deviating from everybody else, such that, you know, school then takes it and narrows their thinking. So take a look at Ken Robinson's. It lasts only 15 minutes. It's highly entertaining. You may be tempted to agree with what he's saying, but I invite you to read what he's saying in the light of the article I asked you to read, which says, look, this idea that young children are the ones who are creative and then we stifle their creativity is misleading.
Thank you very much, Dr. Harris, for this answer, and also Dr. Sophia for posing the question. So we completed our chat box with the question. So now my question, shall we come to an end, or Dr. Harris, would you like to have a last call for questions? Shall we use the remaining proposed minutes of this meeting? Or
well, let me just say a few words, and then I expect Sid would like to round things off.
Yeah, before we hand over to Dr. Sid. Exactly.
So just to thank you all for this really fascinating range of questions. As you will have noticed, sometimes I've disagreed with you, but I hope you don't mind my doing that. The idea is to provoke reflection on these topics. And hopefully some of you will be tempted to think about ways in which the conversations we've had could be incorporated into your own research if you're on the PhD track or otherwise engaged in research. I would be very rewarded if that proved to be the case in the longer term. Over to you, Sid. Over to you, Dr. Sid.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Harris. Yes, Sid, the microphone is yours.
Thank you, Dr. Paul. Well, this is really great fun. As you said, a diverse set of questions and really very interesting answers, calling on your wide range of knowledge, your modesty. You're telling us where you feel uncomfortable talking about something, even if you did speak about it, but you told us why. And that's important also. So I think people learned a huge amount from not just the content, but the ambience. That's a word for Yamuna too. And for your attitude about knowledge and our limitations in understanding ideas as far as we've gone so far. So it's clear your limitations are not enormous, and I know you think that they are, but I mean, you know what I mean. You have an extraordinary amount of knowledge about many domains. And as I said, very important is recognizing what you don't know and also saying things that people don't necessarily want to hear or we're not ready to hear. So thank you for all of that, really. So I've just a couple of, I don't expect that I'm not asking for an answer, just a few quick comments. So I'm like you as a stuck in the mud person, an old geezer about 21st century skills on one hand. On the other hand, something is happening happening right now, and that is the digital world, the world of AI, machine language, putting chips in bodies to replace parts, other animals' organs to replace human parts, and how you come to think of yourself and knowledge and the world that surrounds us and other people and moral issues that arise as a consequence of this seems to lead to the beginning of a different consciousness, one that we haven't had before, because we didn't really have what we have right now, and it's just beginning. So I know about 21st century skills, but the 21st century is introducing us, I think, to, or making us think about our consciousness in ways that other generations did not think. That's number one. Number two, you mentioned questioning and how youngsters, toddlers, ask questions, often informative, but beyond that as well. And because I'm also stuck in the mud about what I'm about to say, I think that those are requests for teaching. So not only do the children teach when they're young, as you know, but they also request to be taught, meaning they know who they can turn to who has knowledge. They won't turn to their little brother to ask questions that the brother doesn't know. They don't turn to the family pet dog or to a table. They turn to somebody who they believe has the knowledge, and that those people that they turn to are reliable and can be trusted. But in the end, fundamentally, it's a request to be taught. Last thing, I had a PhD student who worked on children's developing understanding of theater. And in theater, she was interested in actors, scenery, the story being told, etc. It's a really fascinating piece of work. The one that your talk conjured up had to do with actors. And actors have a special kind of role, let's say. They're actually two people. They're the person who is there and the role that they are presenting as actors. And the child has to come to separate the two. When young children, 3, 4, maybe 5, don't grasp that the actor is acting, that it's a kind of pretense. They think when asked, where does one of the actors, where does he go when the play is over? And the children think, well, I don't go anywhere. He lives there, or she lives there. And so they didn't get a sense of actors acting. They can't say he was a good actor because it means that he was a good pretender, and they can't do that. But that is at a time when they're witnessing pretense, not like pouring with the teapot, but another, well, there is a family resemblance in a way of pretense. Yet by age 5, they have difficulty understanding what that pretense is. So it's just something to think about. As I said, when you were talking about it and I read your article, I was thinking about that kind of research. And although I said it was the last thing, here is the really last thing, and it's even a promise. Yesterday, I was at my daughter's and her 4-year-old, about to be 5-year-old grandson, and I were talking. And he said, Earth is like all the planets and the stars that we see. It's round and it's in space. And I said, yeah, well, that's it. That's pretty neat. So where is Earth? And he said, it's in space. I said, well, where is the space that the Earth is in? And he pointed to the sky. I said, so where's the Earth? Where's Earth? And he had no idea what I was talking about. When I told him that he was standing on Earth, he was shocked by the idea. And then he thought that I was a little daft because how can you stand on a ball or a sphere like all the other spheres, etc. So sometimes you give an explanation and he has a way of understanding things, but limited, so that when you do teach, a child something like what I just mentioned, if it's not part of their experience in the way that you were talking about it, it would be hard for them to use their imagination to think about something that they're actually a part of physically. So I said too much. Paul, really, Dr. Paul, thank you so very, very much. The fact that you were willing to go beyond the regular time that we had fixed was a sign for me that you were enjoying yourself.
Absolutely.
As well. And for that, I'm very happy. And we are all grateful for your coming and being with us, having a conversation, and showing, introducing us to your way of understanding and thinking about what it is that interests you. So again, thank you very much. I know that people have written in chat how much they enjoy what it is that they heard.
So thanks to all of you, and hope to see some of you maybe in the future, especially Dr. Sid. You know, it's time for lunch soon.
I know. I haven't had Thai food for a long time now. Okay, Paul.
Okay.
Thank you.
Bye, everybody.
Bye. Bye. Bye.
Thank you very much, Dr. Harrison. It was
Bye
really
now.
very delightful and enlightened.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Paul. Thank you so much.
You're very welcome. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, Dr. Paul. Bye-bye.
Bye now.
Thank you.